Welcome to the video on logical structures of an argument. So what we're going to do is talk about logical arguments as they're related to real-world arguments. So in many cases, when you're introduced to logical arguments or structures of an argument, you'd be introduced to it in a philosophy class, but for the sake of this course and for the sake of the writing nature and analysis of an argument, we're going to review arguments from Aristotle's and then also Toulmin's method of logic. So let's go ahead and get started. So a couple of things about real world arguments is, number one is that they seldom prove anything. So even though as humans we want something to absolutely prove something else, or in this case an argument, we often don't do that. So most of the time arguments are actually just aiming to make a case for something, to push something forward, to have the opposition consider the points as at least somewhat valid. But overall, will we ever get really hardcore proof of anything? Not necessarily, especially when it comes to arguments in the real world. The other thing too is that they can only really make a good case for something in the sense of that it's either more or less strong or more or less probable. So is something probable to occur? Is something probable, to happen, depending on what the argument is? So we are never going to experience a perfect argument. So when you're conducting your argument analysis, even though you are critiquing it, you also have to recognize that you're probably not going to have a error-free argument, but for the most part you're looking to see for essay number 2 as to whether or not the argument is strong or weak, or in this case making the case more strong or more or less probable. The other thing too is it aims to strengthen the resolve of those who agree with you or weaken the resistance of those who oppose you. So in other words, that if you're making an argument, you are further stressing your case. So even if your audience are people that share the same beliefs or kind of agree with you for the most part in relation to the topic or argument that's being made, the goal then is to strengthen that conviction basically, as well as if the person or audience is opposing you, then you are strengthening weakening the resistance of those who oppose. So basically you're not going to necessarily convince somebody overnight through an argument, but for the most part the resistance of those who oppose would be more or less weakened. Finally, as we stated, that it's not really about proofs or dramatic shifts in positions, beliefs, or perceptions. So as you know in the class, we're kind of reading on the themes of that, like our first article, first reading about the opposing viewpoints, and then of course the theme of the class, which is in regards to perception, that ultimately the arguments are not designed to completely shift somebody's belief systems or positions or stances. We know those run deep with people, but again, reverting back to the previous point, it's more to either weaken the resistance of those who oppose, but also strengthen the resolve between those who agree. So when we consider real world arguments, we want to first consider assumptions, right? So we have to ask what assumptions have to be made for an argument to be plausible. So if we look at the first sentence here, after school jobs are bad for teenagers because they take away study time, is to take a step back and consider what assumptions would the audience have to have been made, or the assumptions based off the writer, what they would have to make in order for such an argument to be plausible. So take a moment and think about assumptions that would have to be considered. So we notice that there might be a couple, right? That first, we consider that they might be bad for teenagers, so we have to make assumptions what bad means. So that could very well be things like, procrastination, or it could be things like that their, grades are going down if they have an after-school job. It could also be considering that more time is being paid to the job versus school for the most part. And so we could probably list a few other assumptions, but again, we would always have to consider what assumptions are being made in relation to, whether or not the argument is actually going to be plausible in this case. So as we look, we can see here something that's called an enthymeme, okay? So an enthymeme is basically an incomplete logical structure. And in order for it to be complete, or for its completeness, there has to be one or more unstated assumptions, right? So when we talk about assumptions, it means values, beliefs, principles that serve as sort of the starting point of the argument, okay? So one way to look at it, of course, the enthymeme being after school jobs are bad for teenagers because they take away study time. Well, ultimately, our claim is that after school jobs are bad for teenagers. Well, the reason, which is often inflicted by the because statement, that they take away study time. And so an unstated assumption, if you consider this, that we would assume that loss of study time is bad for teenagers, right? And of course, if your audience accepts this assumption, then you would have to supply, another argument to support it, essentially, until you find a common ground with your audience, okay? So if the unstated assumption is loss of study time is bad for teenagers, again, you would consider other elements too. What does that necessarily mean in regards to, what is considered bad, okay? So let's consider these important points. That number one, claims are supported with reason. As you saw in the breakdown, the reason is usually indicated by the word because. And so a because statement is attached to a claim in order for it to make a complete logical structure. So we need a reason for this claim. Now, why that's important is you'll see this in many arguments in the real world, right? So some people will make some generalizations. We're going to talk about that with logical fallacies and certain claims, right? But they are not necessarily supported with a reason. And even more so, that reason is not supported with evidence, okay? So it's necessary for most arguments to include the reason for the claims. So when you're reading your articles, that's going to be one thing that you're going to want to look for, is to ensure that the author, for all the claims that they're making, that it is supported with a reason in order to make a complete logical structure. So in this regard, then, it serves as an effective starting point for the argument. As I said, it's the unstated assumptions that are beliefs, values, or principles that the audience allows or grants, right? So if the audience says, okay, fair enough, we can accept the fact that loss of study time is bad, then you would build upon that argument. Okay, so let's take a look at the equation here. So the argument is one, the initial enthymeme. Remember, it's not complete until you have the reasons. So cocaine and heroin should be legalized. So if we stop there, we would need to complete it with the reason. So we have the word because there to do that. So now we will complete it. Legalization would eliminate the black market for drugs. So what's the claim? That cocaine and heroin should be legalized. The reason is because legalization would eliminate the black market for drugs. Now, the unstated assumption that's happening here, of course, is an action that eliminates the black market for drugs is good, or that the benefits of eliminating the black market in drugs far outweighs the negative effects of legalizing drugs. Now, when we see the equation here, the unstated assumption is that the only way we would even make this claim, right, is that at least in some regard, that the audience would believe these things to be true, okay? So we're not always going to get the unstated assumption. Sometimes writers will actually include that in their argument if they want to be explicit or clear, but other times they don't, right? And we have to also be careful with this as well when we're analyzing, is to make sure that the assumption that's being made is in fact one that's legitimate. So as we addressed in our first reading, this idea of echo chambers, right? And people, and knowing that one's audience kind of shares the same beliefs, no matter whether or not they're good or bad. And in this instance, then when they're making an argument, they can get away with a lot more because that they know their audience is not going to hold them accountable with the unstated assumption. So again, going back to the echo chamber, and people will repeat and say, oh, yes, this argument is good because. However, if in the instance that, the audience doesn't necessarily agree, and they can find fault in the unstated assumption, then we already can see that there might be a problem with the argument. So as you're analyzing your arguments in your essays, that's something that you're going to want to consider, right? Is to consider what are the unstated assumptions that they're making in relation to their claim, right? And like I said, they're not always going to be in your face, so you kind of have to see how they build their argument in order to get away with what they're arguing. Okay, so in this equation we have A equals B and B equals C, therefore A equals C, right? But in order to get from A to C, we have to go through B, right? And so that B, or that reason, has to be, have a logical connection. And again, it goes back to, is it reasonable or probable in this instance to suggest that reason based off of the assumptions that are there. So of course, the subject of the claim being cocaine and heroin, B equals drugs that, when legalized, would eliminate the black market for drugs, and then C equals drugs that should be legalized. Therefore, we would say cocaine and heroin are drugs that should be legalized. Okay. Now, you can see how that sounds without B, right? You wouldn't know what the justification was for that, and therefore we would need the reason in order to complete that claim. Okay, so taking the logical arguments further, we're going to add the Toulmin method, and basically it's essentially just renaming some of the elements we already have, but also including a couple more words. So the two new words, or two new concepts in a sense, are grounds and backing. And the word warrant really is another word for reasons, okay? So just a quick review, a warrant is the name used for unstated assumption. It provides guarantees linking our reasons to our claims in order for the audience to buy the argument. So in other words, if we're making a claim, then the warrant acts as sort of a guarantee, right? Like a warranty. It gives us a guarantee that they can progress for their argument because those reasons are strong enough to actually make the claim that it does. The other is grounds, which we've talked about this significantly, the notion of supporting evidence, and that can be done by way of facts, data, statistics, testimonies, examples, hypotheticals, anecdotes. So we have a bunch of ways where we can provide grounds for something. And a good way to think about that, again, is that it's the thing that causes you to make the claim in the first place, right? So what are the grounds for this argument? What do you have to go on? Is another way to put it, which is you must have come across statistics or data or information that is making you want to make this claim. So it's not the reasons per se, but rather the evidence that is presenting itself for you to make an argument for something, okay? And then finally, the backing, which is answers the question, how do you know, or why do you believe that? And this is often tied to the warrant. So let's look at this example here. We have claim, after school jobs are bad for teenagers. The reason, because they take away study time. The grounds would be, and there are actual data right here, but it would be data and evidence showing that after school jobs take away study time. This could be done through, actual research that's done. It could be done through, again, anecdotal evidence. Maybe, you did a survey of students who have after school jobs, but we have to also remember too, when we're analyzing arguments, also when we're creating them, is that we have to also consider the strength, right, of the grounds, of the evidence. So, if we're making the argument after school jobs are bad for teenagers because they take away study time, you as the author, or if you're analyzing another person's argument, will have to consider if the evidence that they provided is strong enough to support the claim that it's providing, right? And so that's part of the analysis for your essay number 2, is to determine whether or not the grounds for their claim is sufficient or strong, and if it is, why, or if it's not, why not. And then we have the warrant, which is basically the assumptions, right? That loss of study time is bad for teenagers. And then the backing would also be that. So in a way, it kind of serves similar to grounds, right? Where it's an argument showing why loss of study time is bad. And so we kind of start the cycle all over again. So grounds to support the claim, but also we would have to support, or create an argument that supports the loss of study time being bad for teenagers. Okay, the other thing we have is called refutation, and this is what I like to call mental chess, which is basically to, figure out how the opposing side might refute your claims, right? And that can happen in many different ways. And so you can attack the reason, you can attack the grounds, you can attack the warrant, and you can attack the backing. And for your article, for your essay number 2, when you're analyzing your articles, those are the 4 different ways that you can start this process by looking at, what is the claim, and then determining whether the reason, grounds, warrant, and backing are supporting that. Now, remember that this can look like a number of different things, so you'll be identifying these aspects with your article. But for the most part, you want to kind of be prepared. So refuting the reasons and grounds, it could be like evidence of teenagers who are able to work with good study habits. It could also be an argument showing that having a job can teach time management. Now, remember, it isn't to say that, that the argument is going to be perfect, but they're trying to weaken the resistance, right? And strengthen, already believers of this concept. But when you have reasons and grounds and it's stronger, right, than the claim and evidence and the warrant and the grounds for the original argument, then that's when you start having a problem, right? The other is refuting the warrant and backing. So we can also have arguments showing that advantages of holding a job actually may outweigh disadvantages, and then arguments showing that job experience and achieving a track record as a good worker may be more highly valued to employers than a GPA. And again, all of this, is something that you want to consider. So when you're making an argument, and this goes back to why we would gather attitudes and perceptions about people before we start arguing, is to kind of get a good understanding of how people see things and assumptions that they might hold, right? And so if a person who's arguing has done their job and their research, they would know what potential refutations might be. So they would create counter arguments in their article. Next is what's called qualifiers, where, of course, there's exceptions to your warrant if the grounds aren't strong. So that means, we're not always going to have strong evidence. There's not always evidence, for example. So, right now, or, during COVID and things, like, people were wanting the grounds that just didn't exist, in the initial stages of, let's say, the vaccine and all of that. So there had to be other things to put into place to support some of the claims, which of course created some of the, discourse and tension between them, because we're so used to having those things when it comes to arguments and claims. In this instance, then, we use qualifiers, and, that's to avoid generalizations of saying, like, all people or everyone who is, X will have this. So they use things like very likely, probably, maybe, some, few, things like that. So you might say after school jobs are bad for teenagers in many cases, or for many teens, or if they know in a certain geographical region, perhaps, that there's more likely there versus staying all students. And the reason is, of course, because they take away study time. So if they have qualifiers, that's fine. But you also have to consider if they have too many qualifiers in their argument and not enough grounds, then that might actually be a little on the weaker side. So you want to consider how they're trying to use these qualifiers as well. Okay, so putting it all together, we start with the original enthymeme. That's your claim with because clause. So that means it's whatever you're claiming and then the reason why. And so the point obviously being whatever your position is, and then the reason, of course. Then you have grounds. So this is the evidence, as we said before. A equals B. So we need to know where, or the jumping off point, right? What's actually causing you to make this claim. Then you have your warrant, which is an originally unstated assumption behind your enthymeme. Again, what are the statements of beliefs, values, principles that they're going off of, right, in order to make the claim that they're making, and the way that they're making it, and watch for word choice, right, because that will also be a pretty good indicator what the unstated assumptions are. And then you have backing, of course, which is the evidence for the other arguments, or for the warrant in this case. So this is how we get from B to C. And then your qualifier, words or phrases limiting the force of your claim. That's few, possible, some, probable. And then your refutation is acknowledging the limits of your claims in anticipation of counterarguments, right? So You might find, again, that some authors will already introduce their, what some of the opposing arguments might be. So that's a way of trying to strengthen their argument, because they're recognizing that they have limitations, or calling their own, limitations out, but then also strengthening it by addressing those. Okay. So ultimately, as you consider arguments, this is the starting point right now. And as you begin and selecting your article, be sure to consider all of those elements. And so we will be identifying those as well.